Chapter 6, Unit 6, Period 6898, Part 6.1, Contextualizing Period 6. Setting the stage, America after the Civil War. All right, let's set the scene. It's 1865. The Civil War has just ended, and the United States is essentially a nation that has survived a near-death experience. The country is battered, divided, and deeply uncertain about what comes next. But here's the fascinating thing over the next 33 years. From 1865 to 1898, the United States is going to undergo a transformation so radical, so breathtaking in scope, that historians often call it the Second American Revolution. That's period 6. And understanding its context is your key to unlocking everything else in this unit. Think of contextualizing period 6 like adjusting the camera lens before you take a picture. If you zoom straight into any single event, the Transcontinental Railroad, the rise of Standard Oil, the Ghost Dance movement, without pulling back first, you'll miss the whole landscape. The AP exam loves to test whether you can see that landscape. So let's build it together. The big forces reshaping America. 3 enormous forces are colliding during this period, and you want to keep all 3 in your mind simultaneously. Industrialization, westward expansion, and immigration. These aren't separate stories. They're braided together like a rope, each strand giving the other strength and tension. Industrialization is the engine of everything. The United States goes from a largely agricultural economy to the world's leading industrial power in a remarkably short time. Think about that analogy for a second. If the antebellum American economy was a bicycle, the Gilded Age economy becomes a locomotive. The scale, the speed, the power, completely different category. Steel production explodes. Railroads stitch the continent together. And new technologies like electricity and the telephone begin reshaping daily life. The rise of big business and enormous corporate monopolies, what the AP calls the growth of large-scale corporate businesses, is central to this period. Westward expansion during this era is not the romanticized pioneer story of earlier decades. This is the completion of continental conquest, and it comes at a devastating cost to Native American communities. Federal policies like the Dawes Act of 1887 aim to break up tribal land and assimilate indigenous peoples, which is a polite word for the systematic dismantling of cultures, languages, and ways of life. The closing of the frontier, famously declared by the Census Bureau in 1890 and theorized by historian Frederick Jackson Turner, signals that the United States has filled its continental boundaries. That's a genuinely disorienting moment for American identity, and it helps explain why imperialist ambitions start building toward 1898. Immigration is the human fuel for all of this industrial growth. A crucial AP concept here is the shift from old to new immigration. Before roughly the 1880s, most immigrants came from Northern and Western Europe, England, Germany, Scandinavia. After that, the flood of people comes increasingly from Southern and Eastern Europe. Italians, Poles, Russians, Jews fleeing persecution. This demographic shift triggers enormous cultural anxiety and eventually produces legislation like the Chinese Exclusion Act of 1822, the first federal law to ban a specific nationality from entering the country. That law alone is a signal worth studying. It tells you something profound about how race and labor anxieties intersected in this period. Politics, reform, and social tensions. Here's a common AP pitfall. Students sometimes think of the Gilded Age as purely an era of robber barons and corruption with no meaningful resistance. Don't fall into that trap. The period is defined by tension between the forces of concentrated wealth and the people pushing back against them. Farmers organize into the Granger movement and eventually the Populist Party. Workers form unions and stage strikes, the Great Railroad Strike of 1877, the Haymarket Affair of 1886, the Pullman Strike of 1894. These are not footnotes. They're the heartbeat of a society wrestling with what industrial capitalism actually means for ordinary people. A helpful mnemonic for the major tensions of period 6 is industrialization, industrialister, expansion, industrialization, expansion, industrialization. those 5 threads in mind, and you'll have a mental framework for organizing almost any document or question the AP throws at you. Why this period matters on the exam. The AP exam will ask you to connect period 6 to what came before and what comes after. That's the whole point of a contextualization question. The Reconstruction era bleeds directly into the Gilded Age as the promise of black citizenship gets systematically dismantled through sharecropping. Black codes, and eventually the Supreme Court's blessing of separate but equal in Plessy v. Ferguson, 1896. And everything happening in period 6. The industrial power, the demographic transformation, the closing of the frontier, sets the table for the progressive era and American imperialism in period 7. The United States doesn't become a world power by accident in 1898. It becomes one because 30 years of industrial growth have made it virtually inevitable. When you're writing a contextualization statement on the exam, don't just name drop a prior event. Explain the relationship. How does it connect, cause, or set up what you're analyzing? That's the difference between a point and a missed point. Now that you've got the big picture in focus, let's zoom in on one of the defining developments of this era, the transformation of the American economy through industrialization and the rise of big business. Part 6.2, Westward Expansion, Economic Development. The Great Economic Pivot. All right. Let's talk about one of the most dramatic economic transformations in American history. And I mean dramatic. Imagine you're watching a time-lapse of the United States between 1865 and 1898 in just a few decades. You'd see a nation shatter its own boundaries, punch railroads through mountain ranges, and turn vast stretches of empty land into an industrial feeding machine. That's the story of westward expansion's economic development, and it's one the AP exam loves to test. The central engine driving all of this, the transcontinental railroad, think of it as the internet of the 19th century. It didn't just move things faster. It fundamentally rewired how the entire economy worked. The Pacific Railway Acts of 1862 and 1864 gave enormous land grants and government loans to companies like the Union Pacific and Central Pacific Railroads. Here's the key detail AP students miss. The federal government gave these companies land alongside the tracks in a checkerboard pattern, which the railroads then sold to settlers and businesses to fund construction. The railroads didn't just connect markets, they created markets where none had existed before. Cattle, crops, and the commodities trap. Once those rails are in place, the economic consequences Sounds romantic, and honestly, it kind of was, but it was also brutally industrial capitalism in action. Then came the farmers, the people the AP exam calls sodbusters. Legislation like the Homestead Act of 1862 promised 100 The Homestead Act had a serious catch. 16 acres was actually too small to farm profitably on the semi-arid Great Plains, where rainfall was unpredictable and the soil wasn't the lush Midwestern loam people expected. Farmers took on debt to buy equipment, steel plows, mechanical reapers, and became dangerously dependent on crop prices they couldn't control. When global wheat and corn prices dropped in the 1870s and 1880s, farmers who borrowed everything were suddenly underwater. That economic squeeze is the direct seed of the populist movement you'll study in 6.13, so keep it in your back pocket. Mining and the boom-bust cycle. Out west, mining towns followed a pattern so predictable it's almost poetic. Discovery, rush, extraction, collapse. gold and silver strikes in places like Colorado, Nevada's Comstock Lode, and later the Black Hills drew thousands of hopeful miners. But here's the analogy that'll stick with you. Mining towns were like sand castles, built fast, impressive while they lasted, and gone almost as quickly. Large corporations with expensive hydraulic and industrial mining equipment eventually replaced individual prospectors. Because extracting deeply buried ore required capital, not just ambition. The individual miner got squeezed out just like the individual farmer. And that pattern, the little guy losing to concentrated corporate power, is the defining economic theme of the entire Gilded Age. Government, capital, and the closing frontier. A critical AP concept here is understanding the relationship between government policy and private capital. The federal government didn't just step aside and let the market work. It actively subsidized Western development through land grants, military protection of settlers, at the direct expense of native peoples, and favorable railroad legislation. Corporate interests and government power were deeply intertwined in ways that would make a modern libertarian uncomfortable. Common AP pitfall is thinking westward expansion was purely about opportunity and freedom. For every farmer who built a successful homestead, there were many more who failed. For Native Americans, the economic development of the West was an economic and cultural catastrophe. The deliberate destruction of the bison, which numbered in the tens of millions and formed the economic backbone of Plains Indian societies, was not incidental to Western development. It was in many ways the point. One mnemonic that helps students organize the key forces at play. Here is Nordgerrod's cattle, land policy, and government subsidies. Those four pillars hold up everything else in this section. Connecting the dots. By the time historian Frederick Jackson Turner declared the American frontier closed in 1893, the West had been thoroughly integrated into the national industrial economy. The small independent farmer and rancher of American mythology had largely been replaced by corporate agriculture, industrial mining, and powerful railroad monopolies. That tension between the promise of Western opportunity and the reality of corporate consolidation is exactly what you need to articulate on your AP essay. The economic transformation of the West doesn't stand alone, though. All of these pressures fed directly into the labor and political upheavals of the Gilded Age, which is exactly where we're heading next. Part 6.3, Westward Expansion, Social and Cultural Development. All right, let's talk about the West. Not the romanticized John Wayne version, but the real, complicated, fascinating West that the AP exam actually wants you to know. Think of the late 19th century American frontier as one giant cultural collision, where different peoples, dreams, and ways of life all arrived at the same place at the same time and had to figure out what to do with each other. Spoiler, it did not go smoothly. The Myth of the Frontier and Frederick Jackson Turner. Let's start with an idea, because ideas matter as much as events on the AP exam. In 1893, a historian named Frederick Jackson Turner delivered a lecture arguing that the American frontier, the constant push westward into open land, was the defining force behind American democracy and national character. This is called the Turner Thesis, a frontier thesis, and you need to know it cool. Turner said that the frontier created rugged individualism, democratic values, and a uniquely American identity. Here's the catch, though. The Census Bureau had just declared the frontier officially closed in 1890. So Turner was essentially writing a eulogy for the thing he claimed made America. America. The AP exam loves to ask you about this, both what Turner argued and how later historians challenged his view. Critics point out that Turner's thesis completely erases Native Americans, women, and non-white settlers from the story. That erasure, it turns out, is its own kind of historical document. Native Americans and federal policy. Now, that erasure Turner committed, the federal government was doing something similar in practice, and far more violently. After the Civil War, the U.S. Army conducted a series of campaigns to remove Native American nations from the Great Plains and confine them to reservations. You should know key events like the Battle of Little Bighorn in 1876, where Lakota and Cheyenne warriors defeated General Custer temporarily, and Wounded Knee in 1892, where U.S. troops massacred hundreds of Lakota people. These weren't isolated incidents. They were the bookends of a sustained policy of dispossession, the government also tried to destroy native culture from the inside out. The atheist door, Dawes Act, Tribs lost about 90 million acres over the next several decades, as surplus land was sold to white settlers. The Dawes Act is a perfect example of what the AP exam calls a policy with devastating unintended or very much intended consequences. Pair that with the boarding school movement, where native children were forcibly removed from their families and sent to schools designed to, as the founder of Carlisle Indian School put it, kill the Indian and save the man. Cultural genocide is not too strong a phrase here. New immigrant communities and ethnic diversity. The West wasn't just a story of white settlers and Native Americans. Chinese immigrants had been building the transcontinental railroads since the 1860s, and by the time the Gilded Age rolled around, significant Chinese communities existed throughout the West. But rather than celebrate this contribution, Congress passed the Chinese Exclusion Act of 1882 as de jure, the first federal law to restrict immigration based on race and nationality. It's a critical piece of legislation that the AP exam references repeatedly. You should understand it as part of a broader pattern. Economic anxiety plus racial prejudice equals nativist legislation. Mexican Americans in the Southwest, many of whose families had lived there long before the Mexican-American War made them Americans, faced land dispossession, legal discrimination, and social marginalization. The West was genuinely multicultural, but the power structure was not. The cowboy, the homesteader, and the reality check. Here's a fun AP pitfall. Don't romanticize the cowboy era. The cattle industry boom of the 1880s was real, but it was brutal, low-wage work, often performed by Mexican vaqueros and African-American cowboys, by the way, and it collapsed when overproduction and harsh winters wiped out herds in the late 1880s. Similarly, the Sweetheart Homestead Act of 1862 Sweetheart promised 160 acres to settlers willing to farm the land, and it sounds like the American dream in legislation form. In practice, 160 acres was often insufficient on the arid Great Plains, and many homesteaders, especially women who shouldered enormous burdens in isolated conditions, struggled or failed. The land that was most successfully claimed often ended up in the hands of speculators and railroad companies rather than small farmers. And a mnemonic to tie it together. Try this. MBDCEH Stifty Disju Da. Act, Chinese Exclusion Act, Extermination Campaigns, Homestead Act Stiftu Do. Those four policies capture the social and cultural tensions of westward expansion, the assault on native sovereignty, the racial limits on who counted as American, the violence of conquest, and the gap between the promise and reality of Western opportunity. The key theme the AP exam hammers home is this. Westward expansion was not just geographic, it was a cultural and social reorganization that produced both national mythology and profound human suffering, often at the same time, with all of that tension between myth and reality. Now, in your toolkit, let's move into how those same pressures transformed American agriculture and gave rise to one of the era's most powerful political movements, the Populists. Part 6.4, The New South. The dream and the reality. All right, let's talk about one of the great marketing campaigns of the 19th century, the idea of the New South. After the Civil War, Southern leaders like Henry Grady, the editor of the Atlanta Constitution, were essentially running a PR campaign for an entire region. The pitch was seductive. The South would reinvent itself, embrace industry, build railroads, attract northern investment, and leave behind its old plantation economy. Grady famously declared in 1886 that the South had found new employment for her people and a new hope for her future. It sounded wonderful, but here is the key tension you need to hold on to for the AP exam. The New South was real in some ways and deeply illusory in others. Industrial growth and its limits. There was genuine industrialization happening. Textile mills spread across the Piedmont South, particularly in the Carolinas and Georgia. Birmingham, Alabama became a center for iron and steel production, earning nicknames like the Pittsburgh of the South. Tobacco processing expanded in Virginia and North Carolina. Railroads crisscrossed the region at a pace that would have been unthinkable before the war. So yes, there were smokestacks and train whistles. But here is where you need to be careful, because this is a classic AP trap. The South industrialized, but it did so on unequal terms. Northern investors owned much of the capital. Southern factories produced raw and semi-finished goods, cloth, pig iron, cigarettes, while the North finished and profited from those products. Think of it like this. The South was doing the prep work in the kitchen, but the North was running the restaurant and taking home the tips. The South remained economically subordinate, a supplier of cheap labor and raw goods rather than a fully developed industrial economy. Agriculture, sharecropping, and the crop-lien system. Here's where the New South dream crashes hard into reality for most Southerners, especially black Southerners. The plantation system was gone in legal terms, but it was replaced by sharecropping and the crop-lien system, which you absolutely must know cold for the exam. Sharecropping worked like this. A landless farmer, often a formerly enslaved person, would work a plot of land owned by someone else in exchange for a share of the harvest, usually around half. Sounds manageable, right? But combine that with the crop-lien system, and you have a debt trap that was almost impossible to escape. Farmers needed seeds, tools, and food to survive until harvest. They got these on credit from local merchants or landowners who placed a legal claim on the future crop as collateral. Interest rates were predatory. Prices were inflated at the company store, and merchants kept the books. By harvest time, sharecroppers almost always owed more than their crop was worth. Year after year, debt accumulated. Farmers were legally bound to stay and keep working, which functionally recreated conditions very close to bondage. The crop-lien system is one of the most important economic mechanisms on the AP exam for this period. Understand it as a legal structure of economic servitude. Racial inequality in the Redeemer South. You cannot understand the New South without understanding the racial terror that underpinned it. After Reconstruction ended in 1877, Southern Redeemer Democrats systematically dismantled black political and civil rights, poll taxes, literacy tests, grandfather clauses, and white primaries, effectively stripped black men of the right to vote. Plessy v. Ferguson in 1896 gave the Supreme Court's blessing to racial segregation, enshrining separate but equal, which was never actually equal as the law of the land. Jim Crow laws enforced rigid racial segregation in nearly every public space, and the violence was catastrophic. Lynching was used as a tool of racial terror and social control, with thousands of black Americans murdered between 1877 and 1950. Ida B. Wells, a journalist and activist from Memphis, launched one of the most courageous investigative campaigns in American history, documenting lynching and arguing that it was fundamentally about economic competition and racial domination, not the pretextual crimes white mobs claimed. Wells is an AP-relevant figure you should know by name. Competing visions, Washington and Du Bois. Two towering figures offered different responses to this landscape. Booker T. Washington, in his famous Atlanta Compromise speech of 1895, argued that black Americans should focus on vocational education, economic self-sufficiency, and proving their value through labor, essentially accepting social segregation in the short term to build economic power over time. W.E.B. Du Bois, writing shortly after in works like The Souls of Black Folk, 1903, pushed back forcefully, arguing that accepting second-class status was a fatal mistake and demanding full civil and political equality. This debate, accommodation versus confrontation, is a recurring AP theme and is almost always tested on the exam. A useful way to remember their distinction: Washington said build the foundation first, while Du Bois said the house won't stand without equal rights from the start. The AP pitfall to avoid. Students often write that the New South was either a complete success or a complete failure. Neither is accurate. The South did industrialize, that's real. But it But it did so within a deeply unjust racial and economic order that trapped most Southerners, especially black Southerners, in poverty and subjugation. The New South rhetoric served the interests of a New South elite, not the laboring majority. Hold that nuance and your essays will stand out. The South struggled to define itself economically and racially. Farmers across the nation, North, South, and West, began organizing against the very financial systems, squeezing them dry, setting the stage for one of the most dramatic political movements of the era, populism. Part 6.5, Technological Innovation. Setting the stage. All right, let's talk about one of the most electrifying eras in American history. And I mean that almost literally. The period from 1865 to 1898 was the age when the United States essentially rewired itself. And the technologies that emerged didn't just change how Americans lived, they changed who Americans thought they could become. If you've ever wondered how a country rebuilding from a devastating civil war managed to become the world's leading industrial power within a generation, this is your answer. The Railroad Revolution. Let's start with the big one. Railroads. The Transcontinental Railroad, completed in 1869 when the Central Pacific and Union Pacific lines met at Promontory Summit, Utah, is the anchor of this entire section. Think of railroads as the internet of the 19th century. They didn't just move things faster. They collapsed distance itself. Goods that once took months to ship could now move coast to coast in days. This created what historians call a truly national market, and that concept is going to show up on your AP exam in some form, almost guaranteed. Here's the key relationship you need to internalize. Railroads enabled mass production, which required raw materials at scale, which accelerated the extraction of natural resources from the West, which drove population migration, which created new cities, which generated new consumers. It's a chain reaction. And railroads are the first domino. When you see an AP free response question about industrialization, you want to trace that domino chain. A common pitfall students hit is treating the railroad as only an economic story. Don't do that. The railroad was also a story of labor exploitation. Chinese immigrants built the Central Pacific under brutal conditions, and a story of federal land grants where the government handed railroads over 100 handed railroads over 100 That land policy question is a classic AP trick. Why did the government subsidize private corporations? Because they saw rapid Western development as a national security and economic priority. Steel, oil, and the infrastructure of industry. Now, you can't have railroads without steel, and you can't have steel without understanding Andrew Carnegie and the Bessemer process. The Bessemer converter allowed manufacturers to turn iron into steel cheaply and at massive scale. Think of it like upgrading from a kitchen knife to a surgical scalpel across an entire industry. Carnegie used vertical integration to control everything from the iron ore in the ground to the finished steel rail. On the track, that phrase, vertical integration, needs to live in your long-term memory. It means controlling every stage of production. And it's Carnegie's signature move. Oil is the companion story here. John D. Rockefeller's Standard Oil used horizontal integration instead. Rather than controlling production stages, Rockefeller bought out or crushed his competitors until Standard Oil controlled roughly 90% of American oil refining. These are two different monopolistic strategies, and the AP loves to ask you to distinguish between them. Vertical equals stages of production. Horizontal equals competitors in the same industry. The inventors and their impact. You also need to know Thomas Edison and his invention factory at Menlo Park, New Jersey. Edison didn't just invent the light bulb, he invented the system of invention itself. He industrialized the creative process, which is honestly remarkable. Electricity transformed urban life, extended the working day, and powered the next wave of industrial machinery. Alexander Graham Bell's telephone, patented in 1876, began collapsing communication distances just like railroads had collapsed physical ones. These inventions compound on each other, so think of them as a rising crescendo rather than isolated events. A, pitfalls and key connections. Here's a pitfall that trips up students every single year. Don't confuse technological innovation with automatic progress for everyone. Yes, industrial output soared. But this same era gave us robber barons, child labor, the destruction of craft workers' livelihoods, and the violent suppression of labor unions. The AP exam expects you to hold both truths simultaneously. Innovation drove growth and created profound inequality. That tension is at the heart of the Gilded Age, and it explains everything that comes next in Unit 6. A useful mnemonic for remembering the key figures and their methods. Carnegie cuts vertically. Rockefeller reaches horizontally. Carnegie cut through the stages of production top to bottom, while Rockefeller reached sideways to absorb every rival. One more concept to lock in: the relationship between technological innovation and the decline of small-scale producers. As factories mechanized, skilled artisans who once controlled their labor and took pride in their craft found themselves replaced by machines and unskilled workers. This fueled early labor movements like the Knights of Labor and later the American Federation of Labor, and that's where your story in 6.6 picks right up. Wrapping up, the core insight of 6.5 is that technology in this era acted as both a unifying force, pulling the nation into a single market, and a dividing force, sharpening the gap between industrial titans and the workers who powered their empires. Understanding that double-edged nature is your ticket to high-scoring responses on the AP exam. As you'll see in the next section, the enormous wealth generated by this technological revolution couldn't stay quietly in the hands of a few for long, and the workers, farmers, and reformers of the Gilded Age were about to make their voices heard. Part 6.6, The Rise of Industrial Capitalism. Setting the stage. Okay, so picture this. It's 1870, and the United States is essentially a sleeping giant just starting to wake up. Within 30 years, your lifetime, if you were born then, it would become the single largest industrial economy on the planet, surpassing even Great Britain. How does that happen? That's exactly what this section is about. And trust me, once you understand the machinery behind this transformation, a huge chunk of period 6 clicks into place. The engines of industrial growth. Industrial capitalism in the Gilded Age didn't just appear out of thin air. It was powered by a very specific combination of factors, and you want to hold on to all of them for the exam. Think of it like a recipe. You need cheap and abundant raw materials, the coal of Pennsylvania, the iron ore of the Great Lakes region, the oil that Rockefeller was about to turn into an empire. You need a massive labor supply, which immigration was generously providing. You need capital investment, meaning money to build factories, and you need technology to make production faster and cheaper. Then you throw in a federal government that is, for the most part, extremely friendly to business through protective tariffs and land grants. Mix all of that together and you get the Gilded Age industrial explosion. The railroads are absolutely central here. They're not just a side note. They're the circulatory system of the whole economy. By 1890, the United States had more railroad track than all of Europe combined. That's staggering. Railroads created national markets, meaning a manufacturer in Chicago could now sell goods to someone in San Francisco. They drove demand for steel, coal, and lumber. They got federal land grants totaling over 170 million acres, which is one of your clearest examples of government actively promoting industrial growth. When the AP asks you why the economy expanded so rapidly, railroads belong in your answer every single time. Monopolies, trusts, and the titans. Now, here's where the personalities come in, and the exam loves to test whether you understand the business structures, not just the names. You've got Andrew Carnegie dominating steel through a strategy called vertical integration. He didn't just own the steel mills, he owned the iron ore mines, the coal mines, the railroads that transported materials, the ships on the Great Lakes. He controlled every step from raw material to finished product. Think of it like owning the farm, the kitchen, the restaurant, and the delivery truck all at once. John D. Rockefeller took a different approach with Standard Oil. Horizontal integration, which means buying up all your competitors in the same industry until you control the market. He then organized this control through a trust, a legal structure where shareholders of competing companies hand over control to a board of trustees. By 1880, Standard Oil controlled roughly 90% of U.S. oil refining. That's a monopoly, and it's one of the AP's favorite examples, so know it cold. A common pitfall students fall into is confusing vertical and horizontal integration. Here's your mnemonic. V is for vertical, and vertical means top to bottom. One company controls the whole supply chain from raw materials down to the consumer. VH is for horizontal. Like spreading out sideways easy, one company absorbs all its rivals at the same level of production. Keep that picture in your head, and you won't mix them up. Social Darwinism and the gospel of wealth. The ideological fuel behind all of this was social Darwinism, particularly as popularized by Herbert Spencer and embraced by many industrialists. The core idea is that the free market is like nature. Competition weeds out the weak and rewards the strong. So government interference only corrupts the natural order. This is why these titans of industry were deeply opposed to labor regulations or antitrust action. They genuinely believed their wealth was proof of their fitness. Andrew Carnegie offered a slightly softer version in his Gospel of Wealth, arguing that the rich had a moral obligation to use their fortunes for the public good: libraries, universities, concert halls. Carnegie actually funded over 500 libraries, but notice this is charity on the wealthy person's terms, not structural reform. The AP might ask you to compare these ideologies, so understand that both defended the existing economic hierarchy while differing on what the wealthy owed society. Workers in the machine. The flip side of all this spectacular wealth accumulation was the lived reality of industrial workers: long hours, dangerous conditions, child labor, and wages that barely kept families housed and fed. This context is the seedbed for everything that comes next. The labor movement, the rise of unions like the Knights of Labor and the American Federation of Labor, and eventually progressive era reform. Don't treat workers as past victims, though. They organized, they struck, and their struggles, Haymarket, Homestead, Pullman, are major AP events you'll encounter in the next sections. Putting it together, the rise of industrial capitalism is essentially the economic engine that drives everything else in period 6. The wealth it created, the inequality it produced, and the power it concentrated in the hands of a few. All of that generates the political and social friction that defines the era. Keep asking yourself, who benefits, who gets left behind? And how does the government respond? As you'll see in the next section, all of that friction starts producing some serious political fireworks, especially out on the Great Plains, where farmers are realizing the industrial economy isn't exactly working in their favor. Part 6.7, Labor in the Gilded Age. The world workers walked into. Picture this. It's 1880, and you've just arrived in Pittsburgh after weeks on a steamship from Poland or Slovakia. You need work. You need it fast, and the steel mill down the road is hiring. The pay is terrible. The hours are brutal. 12-hour shifts, 6 or 7 days a week, and if you lose a finger to a machine, that's largely your problem. Welcome to the Gilded Age labor market. Understanding why workers organized and why they so often failed is one of the most important stories in this whole unit. The industrial economy of the late 19th century created enormous wealth, but it did not distribute that wealth evenly. Real wages for industrial workers did rise modestly over this period. That's a fact the AP exam loves to test, but those gains were offset by dangerous working conditions, brutal hours, child labor, and an almost total lack of legal protection. Workers were legally treated as free agents entering voluntary contracts with employers, a doctrine courts called freedom of contract. In practice, this meant you were free to accept whatever terms the company offered, or free to starve. Not much of a choice. The rise of labor organizations. Workers didn't just accept this quietly. The first major national labor organization you need to know is the FTE Knights of Labor, founded in 1869 and rising to prominence under Terence Powderly in the 1880s. The Knights were genuinely radical for their time. They welcomed skilled and unskilled workers, women, and black workers into the same organization. Think of them as the Big Tent Union. Their goal wasn't just better wages. They wanted to fundamentally reform industrial capitalism through cooperation and arbitration rather than strikes. Here's your key contrast for the exam. The Knights of Labor declined sharply after being associated unfairly with the Haymarket Affair of 1886. When a bomb exploded at a labor rally in Chicago, and killed several police officers. Even though no direct link to the Knights was ever proven, the association with radicalism and violence devastated the organization in the public eye. This is a classic AP pitfall. Students often say the Knights caused Haymarket. They didn't. They were blamed for it. That distinction matters. Rising from the Knights' decline was the American Federation of Labor, AFL, led by the sharp, pragmatic Samuel Gompers. If the Knights were idealists, Gompers was a realist. The AFL organized only skilled craftsmen, carpenters, cigar makers, iron workers, and focused narrowly on what Gompers called bread and butter issues, higher wages, shorter hours, better conditions. When someone asked Gompers what labor wanted, his famous answer was simply more. The AFL deliberately Remember this tension. The AFL's strength came from exclusivity, but that exclusivity had a real human cost. Strikes, struggles, and the state. The Gilded Age saw some of the most dramatic labor conflicts in American history, and you should know the big three. The Great Railroad Strike of 1877, as was the first major nationwide work stoppage. Workers walked off the job across multiple railroads to protest wage cuts, and the federal government sent in troops to crush it. That set a precedent. Then came the Homestead Strike of 1892, where Carnegie steelworkers clashed with Pinkerton detectives, hired by Carnegie's lieutenant, Henry Clay Frick. The strike was violently broken, the union was destroyed, and Carnegie Steel remained non-union for decades. Finally, the Empty-Pearl Pullman Strike of 1894 began when workers at George Pullman's company town, where Pullman owned the houses, the stores, everything, protested wage cuts. Eugene V. Debs and the American Railway Union joined in solidarity, paralyzing rail traffic nationally. President Grover Cleveland obtained a federal court injunction and sent in the U.S. Army over the objection of the Illinois governor. Debs went to prison. The message to workers was unmistakable. The federal government would side with capital. Why unions struggled, and a mnemonic to remember it. Here's a useful framework for your essay responses. Think of the acronym Civil Lose to remember why labor unions faced such an uphill battle. This courts issued injunctions against strikes. Immigrant workers could be used as strike breakers. Violence was used by company-hired forces. Industrial overproduction created desperate competition for jobs, and legislation consistently favored business interests. Anytime an AP free response question asks why organized labor was largely unsuccessful in this period, you have 5 solid defensible arguments ready to go. One more concept to lock in. APUSH, social Darwinism, the philosophy promoted by thinkers like Herbert Spencer and embraced by many Gilded Age elites, held that economic inequality was natural and even desirable. The strong prospered, the weak fell behind, and government interference only weakened the social organism. This ideology provided intellectual cover for opposing labor reform, and it's the philosophical backbone behind laissez-faire economics in this era. Connecting it all. The Gilded Age labor story is ultimately about power, who had it, who didn't, and how ordinary people tried to build collective strength in a system stacked against them. As you move into the progressive era next, you'll see how the failures of this period planted the seeds for the reform movements that followed. Part 6.8, Immigration and Migration in the Gilded Age. The Great Arrival. Imagine you're standing at the bow of a steamship in 1890, watching the New York harbor come into view. You've sold everything you owned, said goodbye to people you may never see again, and crossed an ocean in steerage class. Packed below deck with hundreds of strangers, all chasing a rumor that America was a place where a person could remake themselves from scratch. That's not a metaphor. That was the lived reality for roughly 25 million immigrants who flooded into the United States between 1865 and 1898. Understanding who they were, why they came, and how Americans responded is at the heart of Section 6.8. Old versus new immigration, know this distinction cold. Here's one of the most tested distinctions on the AP exam, and students mix it up constantly. Before roughly 1880, most immigrants came from what historians call the old immigration wave, primarily Northwestern Europe. Think Germans, Scandinavian, Irish, and British. Many were Protestant, relatively literate, and settled into established immigrant communities with some cultural familiarity with Anglo-American life. After 1880, the tide shifted dramatically. The new immigration brought enormous numbers of people from Southern and Eastern Europe. Italians, Poles, Russians, Greeks, Jews fleeing pogroms in the Russian Empire, and Austro-Hungarians. These newcomers were often Catholic or Jewish, spoke languages that sounded completely foreign to native-born Americans, and settled in dense urban ethnic enclaves. The AP exam loves to ask you to compare these two waves, so burn this into your brain. L equals Northwest Europe, pre-18080, new equal Southern Eastern Europe. Post, no, equal Northwest Europe, pre-18080. Push and pull factors. Why did they come? Historians talk about push and pull factors, and this framework is genuinely useful. Push factors are the conditions driving people out of their home countries. Agricultural failure, overpopulation, religious persecution, political instability, or simply grinding poverty. The pogroms targeting Jewish communities in Russia are a perfect example of a violent push factor. Pull factors are what draw people toward a destination. In America's case, the promise of industrial jobs, cheap land, especially earlier in the period, and the mythology of social mobility. Railroads and steamship companies actively advertised in European newspapers, essentially acting as recruiters for American industry. So immigration wasn't purely spontaneous. It was partly engineered by economic demand. Where they went and why it matters. Most new immigrants didn't scatter evenly across the country. They concentrated in northeastern and midwestern cities, New York, Chicago, Pittsburgh, Cleveland, because that's where the factory jobs were. This created the dense ethnic neighborhoods you might have heard of: Little Italy, Jewish Lower East Side, Greektown. Life there was hard. Tenement housing was overcrowded, sanitation was poor, and wages were low. Jacob Riis documented these conditions in his 1890 photojournalism book, How the Other Half Lives, which shocked middle-class Americans and became a catalyst for early reform conversations. That book is worth knowing by name for the exam. The nativist backlash. Not everyone welcomed the newcomers. Nativism, a hostile preference for native-born Americans over immigrants, surged during this period, and it was fueled by a toxic cocktail of racial anxiety, economic competition, and cultural fear. Native-born workers worried immigrants were undercutting wages. Protestant Americans feared the Catholic Church. Pseudo-scientific racism claimed that Southern and Eastern Europeans were biologically inferior. The Chinese Exclusion Act of 1882 is the most important legislative example you need to know. It was the first federal law to restrict immigration based explicitly on race and national origin, barring Chinese laborers from entering the country. That's a landmark moment in U.S. policy, and the AP will test it. The American Protective Association, founded in 1887, similarly targeted Catholic immigrants, and throughout the period you see nativist arguments that would eventually lead to the more severe immigration restriction laws of the 1920s, which comes later in your timeline, but knowing the roots helps. Internal migration, don't forget this half. Here's a pitfall many students stumble into. The section is about immigration and migration, not just immigration from abroad. Don't neglect internal migration. The post-Civil War era saw significant movement of African Americans within the United States, particularly the early stirrings of what would become the Great Migration. While the massive northward movement of Black Americans accelerates in the early 20th century, you should know that during the Gilded Age, many formerly enslaved people and their children were migrating within the South, often to cities or to escape debt peonage on sharecropping farms, and some early movements northward were already underway. Putting it together for the AP, the big interpretive argument the College Board wants you to make is this: Gilded Age immigration and migration fundamentally transformed American society, economically, culturally, and demographically, while simultaneously generating fierce resistance that shaped nativist politics and federal immigration policy. Immigrants provided the labor that powered industrialization, but they also faced systemic discrimination and legal exclusion. That tension between America as a nation of immigrants and America as a nation anxious about who counts as truly American is one of the defining themes of this entire period. One handy mnemonic for the new immigration's key characteristics: it police, it authority driven, land. As you move into the next section, you'll see how these demographic and social tensions fed directly into the reform impulses of the progressive era, because a society that crowded millions of people into tenement cities was eventually going to have to grapple with what it had built. Part 6.9 responses to immigration in the Gilded Age. Setting the scene. Picture this. It's the 1880s, and ships are arriving daily at ports like New York and San Francisco, packed with people from Southern and Eastern Europe, China, Mexico, and beyond. The United States is industrializing at a breakneck pace, and all those factories need workers. But here is the tension. The AP exam loves to test you on. The same economic forces that pulled immigrants to America also triggered a fierce nativist backlash from people who were already here. That push-pull dynamic is the heartbeat of this entire section. The new immigration. Before the 1880s, most immigrants came from Northern and Western Europe. Think England, Germany, Ireland, Scandinavia. AP historians call these the old immigrants. But starting in the 1880s, the demographic story shifts dramatically. Suddenly, the majority are arriving from Southern and Eastern Europe. Italians, Poles, Russians, Greeks, Jews fleeing pogroms. Meanwhile, on the West Coast, Chinese immigrants had been arriving since the gold rush. This shift matters enormously because it fueled nativist anxiety in a new way. Many native-born Americans looked at these newcomers and saw people who spoke different languages, practiced different religions, Catholicism, Judaism, Eastern Orthodoxy, and came from what nativists condescendingly called less civilized cultures. Keep that word nativism close. It means favoring the interests of native-born citizens over immigrants, and it drives almost every policy response you need to know. The Chinese Exclusion Act, 1882. Here's your single most important piece of legislation for this section, and a very common AP essay topic. The Chinese Exclusion Act of 1882. This was the first and for a long time only federal law to bar a specific ethnic group from immigrating to the United States. Chinese workers had been absolutely essential to building the Transcontinental Railroad, doing dangerous, back-breaking work for lower wages. Then, when the economy tightened, white workers on the West Coast blamed the Chinese for driving down wages and taking jobs. Sound familiar? That scapegoating logic repeats throughout American history, which is why the AP loves it as a comparison point. The act suspended Chinese labor immigration for 10 years and barred Chinese immigrants already here from becoming citizens. It was renewed and eventually made permanent until its repeal in 1943. The key concept here is that this represents the federal government actively restricting immigration based on race and national origin, a major turning point in American policy. Nativist organizations and scientific racism. The backlash wasn't just legislative, it was cultural and intellectual, which makes it trickier to pin down, but just as important, nativist organizations like the American Protective Association, founded in 1887, portrayed Catholic immigrants as agents of the Pope and enemies of American democracy. Think of them as a kind of spiritual successor to the Know-Nothing Party of the 1850s. The AP loves having you trace these continuities across time periods. Meanwhile, a pseudoscientific movement called social Darwinism gave nativism an intellectual veneer. Thinkers applied Darwin's ideas about natural selection to human societies and racial groups, arguing that some ethnicities were simply more fit than others. This is a crucial AP pitfall. Do not confuse social Darwinism with actual evolutionary science. It was ideology dressed up as science, and it was used to justify both anti-immigrant sentiment and racial hierarchy more broadly. Efforts to assimilate and resist. Not everyone responded to immigration with hostility. Settlement houses like Jane Addams' Hull House in Chicago, 1889, represent a progressive response, offering immigrants education, childcare, job training, and a bridge into American civic life. Hull House is a beautiful example of how reform movements grew directly out of the immigration experience, and Addams herself is a figure the AP expects you to know cold. The tension between nativist exclusion and progressive inclusion is exactly the kind of complexity that AP free response questions are built around. Immigrants themselves weren't passive either. They built ethnic enclaves, neighborhoods like Little Italy or Chinatown, where they could maintain language, religion, and culture while navigating a sometimes hostile new country. These communities were acts of resistance and resilience, not just geography. The A pitfalls to avoid. Two big mistakes students make here. First, don't assume all Americans wanted to exclude immigrants. Responses were genuinely divided along class, regional, and political lines. Second, don't treat the Chinese Exclusion Act as an isolated event. Connected to the broader pattern of racial thinking, labor competition, and federal power expanding into immigration control, a great mnemonic to remember the causes of nativist backlash. Racial prejudice, racial prejudice, racial prejudice, competition. Those four forces explain virtually every anti-immigrant response in this period. Teeing it together. The Gilded Age immigration story is ultimately about who gets to be American and who decides, a question that will echo loudly when you move into the progressive era, where reformers grapple with that same unfinished business. Part 6.1 Jump Development of the Middle Class. The new America taking shape. All right? Picture this. It's 1885. You're not a Rockefeller, and you're not a coal miner either. You're somewhere in between. You wear a clean collar to work, you have a modest savings account, and on Sunday afternoons, you take your family to a department store just to browse. You are, in the language of the era, respectable. You are, in the language of historians, the American middle class, and your existence is one of the most important stories of the Gilded Age. The development of the middle class in the late 19th century isn't just a feel-good sidebar about prosperity. It's a structural transformation of American society driven by industrialization, urbanization, and a revolution in how people worked, shopped, and thought about themselves. The AP exam wants you to understand not just that the middle class grew, but why it grew, what it looked like, and what it meant for American culture and politics. Why the middle class emerged. The engine here is industrialization. As corporations expanded, they needed people to manage them. Accountants, lawyers, office managers, salespeople, engineers, clerks. These were white-collar workers. People who sold their mental labor rather than their physical labor. Think of it this way. Every new railroad needed not just laborers to lay the track, but a whole bureaucracy of ticketing agents, schedulers, and accountants to run the operation. That paper-pushing army, that's your middle class being born. Urbanization accelerated this. Cities concentrated businesses, professionals, and services in ways that small agricultural communities never could. A Chicago or a Cleveland in 1890 was a place where a young man with some education could become a store manager or a bank clerk, earn a steady salary, and carve out a comfortable life. One concept the AP exam loves here is the distinction between the old middle class, independent farmers, craftsmen, small shop owners who owned their own means of production, and the new middle class of salaried employees. This shift matters because the new middle class depended on large corporations for their livelihoods, which created complicated political loyalties later during the Progressive Era. Consumer culture and the department store revolution. Here's where it gets genuinely fascinating. The middle class didn't just exist economically, it performed its identity through consumption. Department stores like Macy's in New York or Marshall Field's in Chicago were basically cathedrals of middle-class aspiration. For the first time in American history, shopping became a leisure activity. You didn't just go buy flour, you went to browse, to be seen, to participate in a shared culture of respectability and taste. Mail-order catalogs, Sears Roebuck, Montgomery Ward, extended this consumer revolution beyond cities, reaching rural households who could now order everything from suits to bicycles. This is important for the AP exam because it shows how the consumer economy was knitting together a national culture, flattening regional differences, and creating shared middle-class values and aspirations across geography. Women and the middle-class home. The middle-class ideal was deeply gendered, and you need to understand this. The cult of domesticity that had emerged earlier in the century took on new form here. A middle-class household ideally had a male breadwinner and a female homemaker, a woman whose job was to create a refined moral domestic space. This is sometimes called the separate spheres ideology. But here's the nuance that the AP exam rewards. This ideology simultaneously constrained women and gave them new avenues for influence. Middle-class women led the reform movements of the era: temperance, settlement houses, education reform. Jane Addams and the Hull House movement grew directly out of this social location. Women used their domestic moral authority as a launching pad into public life, which eventually feeds directly into the suffrage movement and progressive era reform. Keep that chain of causation in your back pocket. Education, leisure, and identity. The middle class also defined itself through education and leisure. High school attendance expanded dramatically in this period. In 1870, fewer than 2% of Americans graduated high school. By 1900, the number was still modest, but growing rapidly. College attendance, though still elite, was expanding too, particularly through the land-grant universities created by the Morrill Act. Leisure time itself became a marker of status. Spectator sports, particularly baseball, exploded in popularity during this era. Not coincidentally, the National League was founded in 1876. The YMCA, public parks, and eventually bicycling all became middle-class pursuits. Even how you spent your Sunday afternoon announced who you were. Common AP pitfalls. A few traps to avoid. First, don't conflate the middle class with the wealthy. The Gilded Age's famous industrialists, your Carnegies and Vanderbilts, are a different story entirely, covered under the rise of big business. Second, don't forget that the middle class was predominantly white. African Americans, recent immigrants, and most women were largely excluded from middle-class economic security, even when they shared its cultural aspirations. Third, watch out for the temptation to see the middle class as purely a product of individual effort. The structural conditions, industrialization, corporate growth, urbanization are what made it possible. A good mnemonic for the forces shaping middle-class life. Cures, corporate employment, every urbanization, every hotel and consumer culture, every education expansion, every operates, The emergence of the middle class sets the stage perfectly for our next topic. Because this newly comfortable, educated, morally energized group is going to become the driving force behind the progressive era reforms that sweep through the early 20th century. Part 6.11, Reform in the Gilded Age. Setting the stage. Picture this. It's the 1880s, and the United States looks like a glittering party from the outside. Industrialists are building mansions, railroads are stitching the continent together, and cities are exploding with energy. But step behind the curtain, and you'll find something much darker. Workers are labor in genuinely dangerous conditions for poverty wages. Children are working in coal mines, and political machines are selling government favors like candy. That tension between the dazzling surface and the grim reality underneath is exactly why Mark Twain called it the Gilded Age. Gilded means gold on the outside, rot on the inside. And where there is rot, reformers are never far behind. The labor movement takes shape. The first major wave of reform you need to know cold is the rise of organized labor. Think of it this way. When one worker walks into the boss's office and asks for better pay, it's easy to say no. When 10,000 workers walk in together, that's a different conversation. That's the fundamental logic behind labor unions, and it's why they became so powerful and so threatening to industrial capitalists during this period. The Etienne Knights of Labor, founded in 1869 and energized under Terence Powderly in the 1880s, was notably inclusive for its time. It welcomed women, black workers, and unskilled laborers, essentially anyone who worked for a wage. They pushed for an 8-hour workday, the abolition of child labor, and equal pay for equal work. Sound familiar? These ideas feel obvious to us now, but they were radical then. The AP exam loves to test whether you understand the Knights' broad idealistic vision compared to what came next. What came next is the American Federation of Labor, founded by Samuel Gompers in 1886. If the Knights were idealists dreaming of a workers' utopia, the AFL were pragmatists. Gompers focused on what he called bread and butter unionism. Higher wages, shorter hours, better conditions right now. The AFL organized skilled workers by craft, which made it more exclusive, but also more durable. A common AP pitfall here is confusing the two organization strategies. Remember it this way. Knights equals broad and idealistic. AFL equals narrow and practical. The Haymarket Affair of 1886 is a critical turning point you cannot skip. Labor rally in Chicago's Haymarket Square turned deadly when someone threw a bomb at police. The event was used to paint the entire labor movement as violent and anarchist, and it essentially destroyed the Knights of Labor's reputation overnight. It's a vivid reminder that even peaceful reform movements can be derailed by a single dramatic event, and that the press and public opinion matter enormously. Political reform and the populist movement. Labor wasn't the only arena for reform. Out on the farms, a different crisis was brewing. Farmers, especially in the South and Great Plains, were getting squeezed from every direction. Railroad companies charged them whatever they wanted to ship crops. Banks charged brutal interest on loans, and crop prices kept falling while their costs stayed high. Imagine working all year, harvesting a massive crop, and then watching the price collapse before you can sell it. That was the lived reality of American farmers in the 1880s and 1890s. Out of this frustration grew the Farmers' Alliance, a massive cooperative movement that tried to help farmers pool resources and challenge corporate power collectively. The alliance eventually gave birth to the People's Party, better known as the Populists, who ran a serious national campaign in 1892. Their platform, the Omaha platform, is pure AP gold. It called for a graduated income tax, direct election of senators, government ownership of railroads, and a flexible currency based on silver coinage to help debtors. Every single one of those demands is worth knowing because many of them eventually became law, just not in the 1890s. The debate over silver versus gold is a concept students often find confusing, so let's break it down simply. Farmers and debtors wanted inflation. They wanted more money in circulation so it would be easier to pay back their loans. Adding silver to the monetary supply would create that inflation. Bankers and creditors hated inflation for the exact same reason. It eroded the value of the money being repaid to them. When William Jennings Bryan gave his famous Cross of Gold speech in 1896, he was essentially saying the gold standard is crucifying working Americans. His defeat in the 1896 election to William McKinley marked the end of populism as a major political force, but its ideas didn't die. They planted the seeds for the progressive era just around the corner. The AP exam angle. When you see questions about Gilded Age reform, the exam is almost always asking you to think about continuity and change. Which reform ideas succeeded? Which failed? And why? The populists failed to build a lasting coalition, partly because they struggled to unite black and white farmers in the South. where racial politics consistently fractured working-class solidarity, that's a nuance worth carrying into your essays. A useful mnemonic for keeping the major reform threads straight. Labor loves political change. Labor unions, labor legislation, political machines being challenged, and currency in a The Gilded Age reformers didn't fix everything. In many ways, they were just warming up, and that's precisely what makes the next chapter so exciting. As we move into the progressive era, where these same demands finally start reshaping American law and government from the ground up. Part 6.12, Controversies over the Role of Government in the Gilded Age. The big question, should government step in? Picture this, you're watching a game of Monopoly. And one player has already bought Boardwalk, Park Place, and half the board. The other players are going bankrupt one by one. Do you let the game keep running on its own rules, or does someone step in and change things? That's essentially the argument at the heart of the Gilded Age. By the 1870s through the 1890s, industrialization had created staggering wealth for a few and grinding poverty for many, and Americans were deeply divided over whether the federal government should do anything about it. The dominant economic philosophy of the era was laissez-faire, a French phrase meaning let it be, borrowed from classical liberalism and championed by thinkers like Herbert Spencer. Laissez-faire economics held that the market should operate without government interference. Spencer took Charles Darwin's ideas about natural selection and applied them to society, a concept historians call social Darwinism. The argument went something like this. If the wealthy are thriving, it's because they're the fittest. And if the poor are struggling, well, that's just nature sorting itself out. Trying to help them would only interfere with progress. This idea gave a scientific-sounding justification to enormous inequality, and it was enormously popular among the Gilded Age elite. The Gospel of Wealth and its Critics. Andrew Carnegie added a moral dimension to this with his 1889 essay, The Gospel of Wealth. Carnegie argued that yes, great wealth concentrating in the hands of a few was actually a good thing, but those wealthy individuals had a duty to use their fortunes for the public good through philanthropy. Think of it as trickle-down charity. Carnegie built libraries, others funded museums. This let the industrialists have it both ways, defend their fortunes as natural and deserved while also wrapping themselves in moral virtue. But not everyone bought it. Critics argued that the game was rigged from the start. Labor organizers, populist farmers, and reform-minded politicians pointed out that the railroads, the trusts, and the banks were crushing ordinary Americans not through superior fitness, but through monopolistic power and political corruption. The government responds tentatively. Here's where the AP exam loves to test you. The federal government did begin to respond to these pressures, but in ways that were often weak or contradictory. The Interstate Commerce Act of 1887, it's created the Interstate Commerce Commission, the first federal regulatory agency designed to oversee railroad rates and practices. On paper, it sounds like a big deal. In practice, it had almost no enforcement power early on. Think of it like installing a speed limit sign with no police to enforce it. The railroads largely ignored it, and courts often sided with the companies over the commission. Then came the FTAE, Sherman Antitrust Act of 1890, which declared monopolistic trusts and combinations in restraint of trade illegal. This sounds even bigger, and eventually it would become a powerful tool. But in the 1890s, it was used more against labor unions than against the giant corporations it was supposedly targeting. The AP exam frequently asks you to recognize this irony. The Sherman Act's early years saw it weaponized against workers organizing, not against Rockefeller's Standard Oil. The tariff debate and the money question. Two other policy controversies define this era: tariffs and currency. High protective tariffs kept foreign goods expensive, protecting American manufacturers but also keeping consumer prices high. Republicans generally supported high tariffs as engines of industrial growth. Democrats, drawing on Southern and Agrarian constituencies, favored lower tariffs. This wasn't just abstract policy, it was a live debate that shaped every election. The money supply debate in the 90s is one students often find confusing, so let's slow down here. After the Civil War, the government contracted the money supply by pulling paper greenbacks out of circulation and moving toward the gold standard. Less money in circulation meant deflation. Prices fell, which sounds good, but was catastrophic for farmers who had borrowed money at high prices and now had to repay loans in dollars that were worth more than when they borrowed them. Debtors wanted inflation, which meant either keeping greenbacks or, as the populist movement would demand, coining silver freely at a ratio of 16-1 against gold. Creditors and Eastern bankers wanted the gold standard to keep the dollar stable and their investments safe. This tension would explode into the presidential election of 1896. Connecting it all, two visions of America. The fundamental debate of 6.12 is really a clash between two visions. One says the market is self-correcting and government intervention creates more problems than it solves. The other says that without some regulation, concentrated economic power destroys democratic equality. The Gilded Age government mostly sided with the first vision, but the seeds of the second were being planted in farmers' alliances, labor unions, and reform movements that would flower into the progressive era just around the corner. A common AP pitfall here is overstating government power in this period. Their regulatory efforts were real, but genuinely limited. Don't describe the ICC or Sherman Act as transformative victories for reform. Describe them as early halting, often ineffective steps that set the stage for stronger action later. As the Gilded Age wound down, the unresolved tensions over money, monopoly, and government's proper role would ignite one of the most dramatic political realignments in American history, which is exactly where we're headed next. Part 6.13, Politics in the Gilded Age. The glittering surface. Picture a chocolate truffle with a gorgeous gold wrapper. Shiny, impressive, maybe even beautiful on the outside. But bite into it, and something's off. That's exactly the image Mark Twain had in mind when he coined the term Gilded Age in 1873. The era looked prosperous and gleaming on the surface, but underneath, corruption, inequality, and a political system that often served the wealthy far more than the ordinary citizen. As you think about Gilded Age politics for the AP exam, keep that chocolate truffle in your mind. The wrapper is real, but so is what's hiding inside. The party machines and the spoils system. Let's start with what was actually running American cities and states, political machines. These were tightly organized political organizations. Think of them like a local franchise operation that controlled elections, government jobs, and city contracts. The most famous was Tammany Hall in New York City, run for a time by the notorious Boss Tweed. Machine politicians delivered real things to immigrant communities. Jobs, housing assistance, help navigating bureaucracy. In return, those communities delivered votes. It was transactional politics, and it worked for the machine at least. Fueling the machines was the spoils system, sometimes called patronage. The phrase comes from the expression, to the victor go the spoils, and it meant that winning politicians handed out government jobs to their loyal supporters, regardless of qualification. Imagine if every time a new coach took over a sports team, they fired every equipment manager, statistician, and trainer and replaced them with their friends. That's the spoils system. Inefficiency was baked right in. The push for reform, civil service. By the 1880s, the reform movement had enough momentum to force a change. The assassination of President James Garfield in 1881 by a disappointed office seeker, a man named Charles Guiteau, who felt he deserved a government job, shocked the public into action. Congress responded with the Pendleton Civil Service Act of 1883. Which is one of the most important pieces of legislation you need to know for the AP exam. The Pendleton Act created a merit-based system for federal government jobs, meaning applicants had to pass competitive exams to qualify. It didn't eliminate patronage overnight, but it planted the seed of a professional civil service. Think of it as the moment the government decided that maybe your resume should matter more than who you voted for. The two-party stalemate. Here's something that trips up a lot of students. Gilded Age politics was intensely competitive between Democrats and Republicans, yet remarkably little actually changed in terms of policy. The two parties were evenly matched. Nationally, elections were decided by razor-thin margins, and control of Congress flipped back and forth. Presidents like Rutherford Hayes, James Garfield, Chester Arthur, Grover Cleveland, and Benjamin Harrison all served during this era, and most of them are remembered today mainly for having impressive facial hair. That's not entirely a joke. It points to the reality that these presidents had limited impact. Gridlock was the name of the game. Why were the parties so evenly split? Geography and identity. Largely, the Republicans dominated the North and were the party of business, high tariffs, and the memory of saving the Union. Democrats were strong in the South and among urban immigrant communities, opposing high tariffs and favoring limited government. Neither party had a strong incentive to take bold stands on controversial issues because bold stands meant losing votes. The tariff debate and big money. Speaking of tariffs, you'll want to understand this issue because it was the defining economic debate of the era. High tariffs on imported goods protected American manufacturers, but drove up prices for consumers and farmers. Republicans loved high tariffs. Democrats generally opposed them. Grover Cleveland, the only Democrat to win the presidency in this era, made tariff reduction a centerpiece of his platform. The tariff debate also reveals something crucial about Gilded Age politics. Big business had enormous influence. Corporations made massive campaign contributions and essentially purchased favorable policies from both parties. One AP pitfall here, don't assume only Republicans were cozy with big business. Corruption crossed party lines. Third parties and voices of dissent. The two-party stalemate left a lot of Americans feeling unheard. And this is where third parties become important. The Greenback Party in the 1870s and 1880s advocated for expanding the money supply to help debtors, mostly farmers crushed by falling crop prices. They didn't win the presidency, but they forced the major parties to at least acknowledge economic grievances. This sets the stage for the Populist Party in the 1890s, which you'll study in the next section. Think of these third parties as pressure valves they didn't take over, but they forced conversations that the major parties would have preferred to avoid. Connecting it all. A helpful mnemonic for remembering the key reforms and issues. Stamped, stamp. A spoil system, teen to many whole. Assassination, Garfield, merit-based civil service, Pendleton Act. In PRD, stalemates. Run through those 5 points before the exam, and you'll have your anchor. The AP exam loves to ask you to evaluate the extent of political reform during this era. The honest answer is limited but real. The Pendleton Act mattered. The third-party movements mattered. But the structural power of machines, patronage, and corporate money meant that genuine reform was always fighting uphill. With this understanding of Gilded Age political corruption and the first halting steps toward reform, you are perfectly positioned to understand the explosive agrarian and labor movements that would shake that golden wrapper right off, coming up next in the rise of populism. Part 6.14, Continuity and Change in Period 6. Setting the stage, America's Great Transformation. All right, so here we are at the end of Unit 6, and this is where everything clicks together. Think of this section as the moment you step back from a giant mosaic and finally see the full picture. Period 6, spanning 1865 to 1898, is one of the most transformative eras in American history, and on the AP exam, your ability to spimphilize continuity and change across this period is what separates a 3 from a 5. So let's walk through it together. The big question the exam loves to ask is, what stayed the same and what fundamentally changed? Sounds simple, but the trick is that in Period 6, nearly everything changed on the surface, while certain deep power structures stubbornly persisted. That tension is your thesis waiting to happen. The economic revolution, continuity in inequality, change in scale. The most dramatic transformation of this era is industrialization. America went from a largely agrarian nation into the world's leading industrial economy in just a few decades. Steel mills, railroads, oil refineries, the economy was rewired almost overnight. Figures like Andrew Carnegie, John D. Rockefeller, and J.P. Morgan became symbols of a new economic order called corporate capitalism, where massive trusts and monopolies dominated entire industries. But here's where continuity sneaks in. The wealth gap between the powerful and the powerless wasn't new. It just wore a different suit. Before the Civil War, Southern planters held concentrated economic power. After it, industrialists and financiers filled that role. Farmers, industrial workers, and immigrants found themselves at the bottom of a different hierarchy, but a hierarchy nonetheless. The populist movement of the 1890s emerged directly from this frustration, demanding government intervention, currency reform, and protection for working people. When you see a question about the populists, remember, they represent continuity of economic grievance, even as they responded to new industrial conditions, need race and Reconstruction, the unfinished revolution. This is where the continuity change framework becomes heartbreaking and historically crucial. Reconstruction briefly promised a genuine transformation in American racial dynamics. The 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments, what historians call the Reconstruction Amendments, represented a radical legal break from the past. Black Americans voted, held office, and built communities. That is real, meaningful change. But by the 1870s, and certainly by 1870, Reconstruction was being systematically dismantled. The Compromise of 1877 effectively ended federal enforcement in the South. Jim Crow laws, sharecropping, convict leasing, and racial terror replaced legal slavery with new systems of coercion. The Supreme Court's ruling in Plessy v. Ferguson, 1896, enshrined separate but equal and gave legal blessing to segregation. The AP exam absolutely loves this pattern: dramatic legal change followed by social and political continuity in racial hierarchy. Don't let the the West and indigenous peoples. Expansion continues. Westward expansion didn't start in period 6, but it reached its violent conclusion here. The federal government's campaign against Native American nations through warfare, forced removal to reservations, and cultural destruction via boarding schools represents a grim continuity of settler colonialism stretching back to the colonial era. What changed was the final closure of the frontier, declared officially in the 1890 census. The Dawes Act of 1887 is a key piece of legislation to note. It broke up tribal lands into individual allotments, destroying communal structures under the guise of assimilation. The intent was to erase Native identity while seizing millions of acres of land. Continuity of displacement, change in method. Immigration and social change. New faces, old tensions. Period 6 brought waves of new immigrants from Southern and Eastern Europe. Italians, Poles, Jew-Slavs, joining Chinese laborers already present in the West. Nativist reactions were fierce and familiar. The Chinese Exclusion Act of 1882 was the first major federal law restricting immigration based on ethnicity, and it reflects a continuity of nativist anxiety that dated back to anti-Irish sentiment. In the antebellum... Cities swelled, tenements crowded, and the contradictions of American democracy became impossible to ignore. Quick AP pitfall to watch. One of the most common mistakes students make on free response questions is treating period 6 as deports purely a story of oppression. The exam rewards nuance. Use the continuity change framework like a lens. Industrialization changed the economy's scale, but continued concentrating power. Reconstruction changed the law, but could not immediately change social reality. Westward expansion continued, but reached geographic and ideological limits. Your essay scores will jump when you hold both sides of that tension simultaneously. A helpful mnemonic to remember the major themes: FGE, wire as Jew, FGE, expansion and native displacement. If industrialization, monopolies, and labor as race, Reconstruction's promise and retreat. Immigration, new waves, old nativism, 4 threads, 1 tapestry. As we move into period 7, you'll see how these unresolved tensions, especially over labor, race, and American power abroad, explode into the progressive era and beyond, proving that history rarely wraps itself up neatly at the end of